Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is our part 3 of 3 on psychedelic-assisted therapies. And today specifically, we'll be speaking about psilocybin-assisted therapy, looking at history, basic science, neurophysiology, clinical applications, and the overlap with spirituality, meditation, and transcendence. If you are collecting your continuing medical education, you can use the activity code 11ACRE. We can put that also into the chat so people can see that. And if you're not using EADS, you can register for EADS on your phone and then enter 11ACRE. But again, that will be available for you during this presentation, but also after. If you have questions, you can email us so that we can help you with that. Let me see here. Our mission for the Institute for Integrative Health and Wellness is to promote the health and healing of individuals, families, and communities we serve through the advancement of the practice of integrative health and the science upon which it is based, and the education of healthcare practitioners and the USC community, as well as our surrounding communities. Our vision is to transform healthcare by establishing a collaborative, holistic paradigm that promotes health and healing and integrates all aspects of human life: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, cultural, social, and environmental. The USC Center for Mindfulness Science is a collaborative hub for interdisciplinary research into the nature and practice of mindfulness. And their aim is to use the tools of science and systematic inquiry to shed light on the constituents of mindfulness and individual and interpersonal and social impacts of mindfulness practices. CMS aims to better understand how mindfulness and related contemplative practices affect our minds, our bodies, our social world, with an eye towards building a more integrated, aware, and compassionate society. So as you can see, this is a collaborative between USC Centers for Mindfulness Science and USC Institute for Integrative Health and Wellness. It's important to acknowledge the land from which we live and we teach and we educate and we have experiences and we learn, to understand and acknowledge the presence of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. And we recognize that these peoples were forcibly removed from their homelands. We take this opportunity to acknowledge the generations that have gone before us, as well as the present day Gabrielino Tongva people. With humility, we recognize and respect all indigenous peoples, their histories, and their ties to the land. We recognize other traditional ancestral groups in these lands as are listed here. We pay respect to their past and their present. Let this acknowledgement serve as an ongoing reminder of the original inhabitants, where we reside, where you reside. Again, this is your EADS for CME credit. So you can actually use your phone and snap that QR code and go on and again, upload your or download your EADS mobile app and enter that code to get your credit. I also want to recognize the hardworking group executive steering committee and staff of the IIHW. They are all listed here. I'm very proud to work with many and all of them on the projects and the work that we do collectively. And I'm very thankful for Dean Varun Soni, who's in the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, who support and is our home to the IIHW. I also want to recognize directors and steering committee of the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, for which Dr. Rael Khan is director, along with Sean Roll and their steering committee. So again, many thanks for lots of people doing this very important work. Today, I'll be introducing the 3 presenters, and also I'll be moderating the Q&A to be very respectful of our presenters so they can impart to you what they have planned to share. We'll hold the questions and answers to the end. You can type into the Q&A, and I will be managing those questions at the very end of their 3 presentations. IIHW is having a symposium in July looking at virtual reality and healthcare, just to show you the depth of which we operate as an integrative group, as well as CMS has a keynote presentation on mindfulness from MRI to mobile health, with Kathleen Garrison, and is April 26th at noon. So just in 6 days. All right, thank you. We're going to stop that sharing. So I'll get the faces up here. Perfect. And with that, I will go about introducing our first presenter, Dr. David Presti. He teaches biology, psychology, and cognitive science at the University of California, Berkeley, or as we like to say, Cal, where he has been on the faculty in molecular and cell biology for more than 30 years. For more than a decade, he worked in the clinical treatment of addiction and of post-traumatic stress disorder at the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center in San Francisco. And for the past 20 years, he's been teaching neuroscience and conversing about science within the Tibetan Buddhist monaistics in India, Bhutan, and Nepal. He has his doctorates in molecular biology and biophysics from Caltech and in clinical psychology from the University of Oregon. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. David Presti as our first speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be part of this conversation. So thank you for the invitation to be here today. As stated, I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and I'd also like to acknowledge that the campus of Berkeley and the city of Berkeley all sit on the unceded land of the ancestral inhabitants of this land, who some of which are still very much alive today, the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, and we are grateful and honor being able to be hosted still on this land today and benefit from it in the ways that we have. Let me share my screen here and get started. Okay. I assume someone will tell me if that's not working. My task here today is to provide a general background to psilocybin-containing mushrooms and the molecule psilocybin and the related molecule psilocin, and some of their basic properties in terms of chemistry and neurobiology. And I'm kind of here is sort of the agenda I would like to get through in the next few minutes. First of all, a little bit about how amazing mushrooms and other fungi actually are, and something about the history of the human relationship with these beings, and their global distribution and variety of the psilocybin-containing mushrooms and how they entered into contemporary culture. The particular molecules, psilocybin and psilocin, that we hear about these days, and a little bit of material related to that in terms of how we got that concept of molecules and how we began to research psychedelically active molecules in the 20th century, and then where we are today. And then I know that Dr. Grobe will take us into the world of the clinical research and findings. So, first of all, the excuse me, the amazingness of mushrooms is manifest mostly by what we don't see of these organisms. So the mushrooms are just, as many of you I'm sure know, are the fruiting bodies, the spore-producing bodies of a vast underground network of mycelia, which is most of the bulk of the fungus. And the mycelia are deeply interconnected with the microbial world of the soil, the root systems of trees, and other plants, the mycelial systems of other fungi. There's a vast symbiotic relationship that contemporary biological science is really only now appreciating in the last, say, 1 to 2 decades, how extensive this world is of fungal mycelia, and how essential it is to the operation of life as we know it. We have within our bodies and on our bodies fungi living that are in symbiotic relationship with our own physiology, and the health and non-health of those systems on our body, our microbiome, very much are related to, how our own health is manifest. So fungi has an interesting history, because if you go back even a generation or two, fungi weren't appreciated by many people to be, excuse me while I take a drink of water here. If we go back a few decades, in many people's view, it wasn't even appreciated that these were anything other than plants. And here's a book, a field guide, very popular field guide that some of you may have grown up with, the Golden Guide series. And here the fungi are being called non-flowering plants, along with other things like ferns and so forth. And this was also an era where just a few years after that, there was actually a Golden Field Guide, a kid's book on hallucinogenic plants that featured psilocybin mushrooms as one of the things in the book. Now we appreciate that fungi are a vast kingdom, that older than the plants, older than the animals, and deeply symbiotic with all plants and animals insofar as we are able to investigate at this time. When it comes to the interaction of human cultures and mushrooms, we know that from various kinds of iconography that the history goes back thousands of years. So, for example, there are mushroom-shaped stones that come from Central America and South America that have been dated as old as 2,000 years from parts of Guatemala and so forth. There are examples of rock art from around the world, the oldest ones being from southern Spain and from northern Africa, which have been dated from 6,000 to 9,000 years old and appear to depict things that look like mushrooms. Now, we don't know anything about the medicinal activity of these mushrooms or whether they were psychoactive or not, but it does suggest that they were revered enough among peoples of those times to be represented in the rock art, whereas, many things were not represented in rock art. If you look at even older rock art from East Africa and from far northwestern Australia, some of those rock arts have been dated as potentially more than 10 to 12,000 years old, and they have things that kind of look mushroomy drawn among them. So there are suggestions of long human relationship with mushrooms and speculations of that relationship with humanity going way further than that back in time. This is a somewhat famous drawing by the visionary artist Alex Gray from a number of years ago, which is his way of representing what has come to be called the stoned ape theory, that maybe ancient hominin ancestors ingested psychoactive mushrooms, and because of the sorts of visionary experiences that may be occasioned by that may have catalyzed reconfiguring neural processes in some way as to actually expand upon the cognitive function of the human brain and mind in a way that may be not only develop various aspects of so-called higher cognition, but also things like language and relationship with kind of a spiritual world and so forth. The reason this kind of theory makes a lot of sense in a way is because psilocybin-containing mushrooms, that is, the potent psychedelically active mushrooms, are found all over the planet. This is a map that dates from 25 years ago, really, put together by a scholar of psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, Guzman, who's now deceased. And at that time, he had noted the locations of roughly 100 different places or so around the planet, and many, around that same number of different species here. I know that there are more sites that are not marked on this map, that including southern China, that have since been found to have what appear to be indigenous species of psychedelically active mushrooms as part of their local biosphere. So the fact that they're found so pervasively all around the planet, wherever folks have looked for them, makes it hard to believe that humans who inhabited these various places wouldn't have munched on a few of these things and experienced in some manner their visionary properties. There are over 100 species, as I mentioned. Here are some close-up pictures of several that grow in this area. This is Psilocybe cubensis, the most famous one that is widely cultivated. It may not be indigenous to where I am right now in Northern California, but it was actually first found in Cuba. That's why it's called cubensis, at the beginning of the 20th century and identified there. And it has been found in a number of places in Asia and so forth. But because it is widely cultivated, it could have spread around by that kind of human dissemination. This is Psilocybe similanceata, or the Liberty Cap mushroom, which grows abundantly in the Pacific Northwest. And Psilocybe cyanescens, which grows on the UC Berkeley campus, among other places, and a relatively new species, Psilocybe alleni. So all over the world, but in terms of written history is very much more recent. And the oldest text that may have been describing something that may have been a psychoactive mushroom is the Rig Veda, which is an ancient Vedic text in the very early days of Hinduism, or even pre-Hinduism, text of hymns and prayers, more than 3,000 years old. And there's a substance, a living material of some kind called soma, which is mentioned in there. And the identity of soma is debated. Nobody knows what it is. It appears not to be a plant because of the descriptions that were given, not having leaves and so forth. Something may have been a phedra, a leafless plant, and others think it may have been some kind of mushroom and may have well been a psilocybe mushroom. They grow all over Asia, so who knows? But the oldest evidence for actual use of what we now understand to be the psychedelic psilocybe mushroom comes from the texts of Spanish missionaries that came along with the conquest of Mexico in the 1500s, and documented the traditional uses of the traditional ceremonial practices of the people that had been living there, the folks that we now call the Maya, the Aztec, and so forth. And they talked about a mushroom, something that was clearly a mushroom in their language, called Teonanacatl, which literally translates as flesh of the gods. And this was written up and illustrated quite extensively by various folks in the 1500s. Some of those manuscripts are still preserved today. The most famous one is called the Florentine Codex. It's in the Laurentian Library in Florence, Italy, and is extensively illustrated and documents the ceremonial use of these materials. So these indigenous practices, first documented in writing 500 years ago, likely go back millennia, and are only known, as I mentioned, with any kind of definitiveness from the Mesoamerica. And in about close to 100 years ago now, the famous pioneer American ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, when he was a graduate student at Harvard in the 1930s, got very interested in the possibility that there was the use of a mushroom in some ceremonial or medicinal healing manner by peoples in Mexico at that time, and got hold of copies of the texts from the 1500s that at that point had not been translated into English. So he read them in French translation because he didn't speak fluent Spanish at that time. He later developed that fluency. And so in the late 1930s, 1938, 1939, Schultes took 2 trips to Oaxaca, Mexico, and ended up in the village of Huautla de Jimenez, trying to locate any evidence for the contemporary use of psychoactive mushrooms. He got some samples of mushrooms, which he tentatively identified, but he was not able to connect with any people that were practitioners with these materials. He came back to Harvard. He wrote it up as part of his dissertation. It was published in the journals of the Harvard Botanical Museum, so kind of a obscure place. And then if World War II hadn't been about to happen, he probably would have gone back and sort of pinned down the usage a little bit more precisely at that time. But World War II was about to break out, and Schultes really wanted to go to the Amazon to study the ethnobotany of Amazonian plants. And so he figured he better get there before the war started. So he went to South America and proceeded to spend the next 5 years there, or really the next 20 years there, but pretty much full time for the next 5 years. And so that work kind of got forgotten until it was rediscovered in the early 1950s by Gordon and Valentina Wasson, who were a couple from New York City that were enthusiasts for mushrooms and human relationships with mushrooms of various kinds, medicinal, culinary, potentially psychoactive, and so forth. And they connected with Schultes, got his papers, and they decided they would follow up. They went down to Oaxaca, to the same village, and the kind of the rest is history in a way, which I'll briefly go over. So the Wassons ended up in this is a picture of Schultes on the left when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. And at this point, he was investigating peyote and the peyote ceremony in collaboration with peoples who were using it ceremonially in Oklahoma, and an anthropologist, Weston LaBrere, who was trying to document the indigenous ceremonial use of the peyote cactus. And so Wasson and his wife Valentina made several trips to Oaxaca, and eventually connected with a medicine woman, Maria Sabina, who agreed to actually give Gordon Wasson, first a ceremonial experience with these mushrooms. So that was a huge, huge decision on her part. And she was a healer. She was highly respected in her community, although folks who worked with those spirit beings, the mushrooms, they had their status in society was also often very liminal because they were working with powerful forces. So it's very complicated, all that was going on there. In any case, though, she made the decision to ceremonially introduce these mushrooms to Wasson, knowing that he was going to talk about it. He was going to, reveal this in some way to the world. He did it in a way that at first was anonymous. There was no identification of Maria Sabina by name or by geographic location, but people were very quickly able to find out where he was talking about. But the article that Wasson wrote appeared in Life magazine in May of 1957. And the discovery of mushrooms that cause strange visions, seeking the magic mushroom. That's quite a catchy title. This magazine at the time had tens of millions of readers. It was, very, very popular. So a lot of folks learned about these materials through reading this magazine. Here's a picture from that article of Wasson and his wife Valentina, who was a pediatrician, and originally from Russia, so grew up in a world of appreciation of the culinary and medicinal value of mushrooms. And she herself, in a lesser known article, but perhaps more widely read even than the Life magazine one, wrote an article the following week that appeared in a newspaper-like insert that would show up in the Sunday newspapers of hundreds of different newspaper outlets around the United States. So again, well over 10 million people were introduced to the mushroom by way of Valentina Wasson's article, which was called "I Ate the Sacred Mushrooms." Again, very provocative or evocative title. So in any case, the word was out, and Maria Sabina, who had been completely unknown outside of her village and the local environment until that all happened. Eventually, her town became a real focus of tourist travel. It became a very difficult scene. The town, which had been very hard to reach in those days and very quiet and undisturbed, really became a kind of tourist destination, as it was at that time, for seekers of psychedelic experience and altered consciousness and so forth. And so it was a very fraught situation in many ways. These are pictures from the Life magazine article that show Maria Sabina in the midst of a ceremony. One of her young children is right next to her, and the picture on the left. So a few years later, in 1970, so now we're 13 years after the Life and This Week magazine articles, Gordon Wasson has a really nice one-page kind of opinion piece in the New York Times, where he talks about the problems that ensued for Maria Sabina, for her town after that, and his own feeling somewhat responsible, for all of that coming down, and yet feeling like this was important information for the world as well. And interestingly, Maria Sabina, in interviews that she granted in the mid-1970s to one of her contemporary Mazatec speakers, Mazatec language speakers that were then translated into Spanish and English, said herself that she herself was conflicted. On one hand, she said the sacred mushrooms have really been degraded and have lost their power as a result of sort of giving away, making this powerful material somehow a source of more public knowledge and awareness and attracting a tourist population and so forth. And on the other hand, she also said that she felt it was the right thing to do, that this information be shared. So a complicated thing. So there's a great movie called Maria Sabina, Mujer Espiritu, Spirit Woman, that is freely available on YouTube. And it was a documentary made about Maria Sabina when she was still alive. And one of the most beautiful things are her songs. She sang during the ceremony of the use of psilocybe mushrooms, as it is practiced by the Mazatec of the Sierra Mazateca in Oaxaca, is to sing almost continuously, and the songs are prayers during the journey. So she's monitoring the healer. The medicine person is monitoring the kind of psychic state of whoever is there with her, and tuning her prayers to that. And so she was really a beautiful poet in her own language with many, many beautiful songs. And some of these were recorded by the Wassons, and many of them are actual part of the soundtrack of this movie. Highly recommended. So let's talk about the molecule psilocybin and the related material psilocin. So where these were discovered in 1958 by Albert Hofmann, the same Swiss chemist who in 1943, just 80 years ago yesterday, on April 19th, 1943, established the powerful psychedelic effects, psychoactively psychedelic effects of LSD, a molecule that he had synthesized. So the LSD experience for Hofmann changed his life in such a way that he felt like this was one of the more important things that he could devote his chemical expertise to studying the occurrence of related things in nature. And so the Wassons were able to, in collaboration with a French mycologist, Roger Haim, were able to get samples of the mushrooms from Mexico to Albert Hofmann, and then Hofmann chemically extracted the various components of these mushrooms and was able to identify two that were powerfully psychoactive in a way that was somewhat reminiscent of LSD, but much less potent, psilocybin and psilocin. And as with LSD, he discovered the psychoactive effects by consuming it himself. The same was true with the mushrooms. So the psychoactive effects are they last 5 hours or so. There's about a 1%. There's about 10 milligrams of psilocybin per gram of mushroom, and psilocybin would not cross the blood-brain barrier, and so it is. The fact that it's psychoactive because of that phosphate group, which has a lot of charge and polarity to it, psilocybin is very quickly, once it enters the body, converted to psilocin, and the psilocin does cross the blood-brain barrier. So the actual active molecule that's doing everything in our nervous system and elsewhere in our body, perhaps, is psilocin, not psilocybin. But the two terms are often used interchangeably. And the conversion happens very rapidly, and it doesn't even have to be orally eaten. If psilocybin is injected into the bloodstream intravenously, within a minute, it's all gone. It's all converted into psilocin. So the psilocin, though, is only found in trace amounts in the mushroom because the psilocybin because the psilocin is very unstable in the presence of oxygen. And psilocybin, however, is very stable in the presence of oxygen, so can last for decades, actually, and if it's well packaged on the shelf. But psilocin would break down relatively quickly, and it actually forms polymers that are blue in color. And so hence the bluing reaction of mushrooms that have been bruised, that the bruising of the mushroom activates an enzyme that converts the psilocybin to the psilocin, and then it polymerizes to form blue things. I want to make one important point here, and that is the profound reduction that we have made in contemporary science from an organism, in this case a mushroom, to a molecule. And we kind of do this routinely, but this is an incredibly profound thing. So rather than talking about the healing capabilities of the entire mushroom and the setting and ceremonial use of it, we tend to focus on psilocybin or psilocin. And really, this is reflection. This is a reflection of very different worldviews, very different cosmologies, very different definitions of what we consider to be real. We consider to be real the molecules, the atoms, the molecules, the matter. That's our notion of what reality is. And in the worldviews of traditions that hold the sacred use of materials like mushrooms and psychedelically active plants like peyote or iboga or the components of ayahuasca and so forth, there's a very different worldview in that what is real is the being, the being of the plant as a sentient being, just as we humans are in relationship, that has the capacity to be a teacher, to be an ally, and so forth. And so, but there's a lot of confusion with this in the way folks talk about this. I hear people say all the time, the indigenous use of psilocybin. Well, there is no indigenous use of psilocybin. There's an indigenous use of psilocybin containing mushrooms, or people talk about the FDA approval of mushrooms. The FDA does not approve mushrooms. It approves molecules, psilocybin. Or what's happening in Oregon right now. People talk about the psilocybin initiative there, but it's the psilocybin containing mushroom initiative. That's what the therapeutic work is being done with. So this profound reduction has been applied throughout, of course, all of natural products chemistry. So we think about everything that all of these plants that have long histories of sacred ceremonial use and are held in very different ways by the cultures that use them as actual beings with whom one is in relationship with. We think of them simply as molecules that we can kind of control in some way and then ingest and experience certain kinds of effects. Now, I'm getting messages that say I should stop. So let's see here. Where would be a good place to stop? Okay, you want to hear something about the neurobiology, I assume. So let me just say this: psilocybin and psilocin are classical psychedelics, and psilocybin and psilocin are classical psychedelics, and all of the classical psychedelics, have a main effect that has been identified in the nervous system of being agonists or activators of serotonin 2A receptors. Serotonin 2A receptors are GPCRs. They're G protein coupled receptors, which means when those receptors are activated, a whole cascade of complicated stuff can happen, including immediate effects on excitation or inhibition of the neuron, but also longer term effects like induction of nerve growth factors, which would manifest aspects of neuroplasticity and so forth. So one can have both short-term and long-term changes, which are presumably important. I think one of the most interesting discoveries that has happened in contemporary neuroscience of psychedelics was just published a couple of months ago. And it seems to establish, and of course this will need replication and expansion upon, that the actual site of binding of the serotonin that is activating a neuroplastic effect in the neurons in the brain is intracellular. And it makes complete sense that might be possible. In fact, I've always wondered by pretty much why it is that all of pharmacology focuses on surface receptors of plasma membranes. So all of psychopharmacology, that's what we talk about. And yet anything that's getting into the brain, any drug that's getting into the brain it's doing so because it can diffuse across the lipid bilayer membranes that form the blood-brain barrier. And if it can get into the brain, that means it can get inside the neuron. So all psychoactive drugs are able to enter neurons directly. And so why wouldn't there be potentially active sites inside a neuron? And these folks actually looked for that and found, sure enough, that it seemed to be the site of significance for induction of dendritic growth in CNS neurons is actually intracellular 5-HT2A receptors. So that's pretty cool. We don't know what this will lead to, but it's pretty cool. So one final word then, and then I'll shut up for a while. The neurobiological, the fact that the brain is complicated and we can only say limited things about it right now in terms of detailed mechanistic understanding of how things are working. But any kind of image of something going on in the brain or that can be conveyed really within the worldview that we hold strongly suggests that there are real physical changes happening in our brain and that we're likely to use this in a way that contributes to therapeutic efficacy. That is certainly likely to be a primary mechanism of so-called placebo effects in psychiatric medications, for example. If we believe something is working because we have a narrative of a certain mechanism, it will contribute to its therapeutic efficacy. And that can be operating at every level, including with psychedelics. And so I like to, in following Stan Grof, I like to think of one component of psychedelic effects as a sort of activation of what Grof called holotropism. That is a movement toward wholeness, a activation of an inner healing intelligence, a capacity to move to heal toward healing, that we know how to do that in some intrinsic way, and that these materials and these contexts in which they're used may facilitate that in some way or another. So how about I stop there for now?
Thank you so much. No, that was brilliant and always fascinating to learn about the history. I think it gives people context, and so we really appreciate that. I wish we had more time, but we don't. But thank you very much. Look forward to the Q&A with you. You can actually turn off your camera because Rael's going to take over the stage now. That's perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So this next presenter is Dr. Rael Khan, a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at USC and directs the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, as well as his lab at the USC Brain and Creativity Institute. He's been involved in brain studies of meditation and psychedelics for the last 20 years. Broadly, his lab is focused on the neurophysiologic changes underlying clinical efficacy of meditation and mindfulness and psychedelic-assisted therapies for depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders. His current research is focused on the brain changes associated with altered self-experience and the relationship to the thinking process in experienced meditators, and is also studying the epigenetic basis to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD in a collaboration with the MAPS Phase 3 clinical trial. So it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rael Khan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steph. So I'm going to keep my presentation a little on the short end, because I really want to make sure to give adequate time, or at least close to adequate time, to gain the wisdom of our two guest speakers who are here with us today, Dr. Presti and Dr. Grove. I'll start sharing my screen, though, for basically a kind of highlight of some of the studies I've done, comparing and contrasting the effects of psilocybin and long-term practice of meditation. So, Jeff, please let me know if my screen is not sharing, but I think it is. Great. So I'm going to be sharing some slides about EEG studies, electroencephalography studies, in both long-term Vipassana or mindfulness meditators, comparing meditation, state of meditation to thinking, as well as the effects of psilocybin versus placebo. Basically, these are studies measuring the electrical activity of the brain as it processes the sensory world under the influence of consciousness-altering practices. And I really appreciate David's last words about not mistaking the map for the territory with regards to brain imaging. And I'll say just at the outset that while I think there are some very interesting insights into how these consciousness altering practices and substances affect brain processes, and what that implies about how the brain works generally and altered states of consciousness are mediated partly through brain. It's also the case that despite many years of study, neither meditation nor psychedelics show a specific highly correlated brain change that's associated with the really interesting alteration in consciousness, whether that be the more simple aspects, where we do have some correlations for all the different domains, but the simple aspects of just visual hallucination or visual alterations, or the more complex multifactorial aspects of a full-blown mystical experience, which tends to drive a lot of the interest in these kinds of substances, psilocybin and other psychedelics. And that the driver of that interest being related to the mystical state, I think both has foundations in our human experience of being alive, and that dramatic impact of feeling the merge of the inner world with the outer world, that dropping away of the boundary between the self and the observed, self and the other, and the experience of the wholeness. Such a deeply felt, meaningful experience that has really organized human societies, and it turns out seems to be at least statistically significantly correlated with their clinical efficacy in the more recent emergence of clinical trials. But that state also, no really significant, highly replicable correlation, despite the many different changes in brain activity that we see. It's just, there's so much variety to how each individual person's brain constitutes their lived experience in the world they inhabit. So I think we're never going to have some key to that state of consciousness or to understanding consciousness alterations generally by understanding a one-to-one correlation, because each of our brains are so different. And I think that's just an important kind of take-home message I'd like to give as a neuroscientist who's been studying these things for 20 years now. But this couple of slides is about using a cognitive science paradigm, the oddball paradigm, to elicit brain activity and look at what aspects of brain activity are shifted either as a result of meditation or psychedelics, and where there may be commonalities and similarities and differences. So this is a schematic representation of an oddball paradigm where a series of standards or beeps are presented to the participant with an occasional oddball sound, a boop. So here's something like beep, 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 boop, beep, 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 and the being like a distractor sound that really tends to grab the attention involuntarily. And so the brain, when hearing a series of sounds like this, becomes habituated to the standards and gives more importance and frontal, reactivity to the oddballs and the distractors that involuntarily engage attention. And one interesting thing in meditation is there's a pattern, which then we see also reproduced in looking at the effects related to psilocybin. And that pattern is an enhancement of the early sensory processing, the so-called bottom-up processing that does not rely as much on the top-down projections of the attentional system seeking to find meaning in the world, but is more related to, although still related to top-down kind of amplification, more related to the bottom-up encoding in that first 100 milliseconds in the brain. So an increase in meditation of the early sensory encoding and a later decrease of automated reactivity when comparing meditation to mind wandering or everyday thinking in long-term practitioners. So this seems to index something about the brain state underlying meditation in folks who really have practiced meditation, that it's possible to tune the brain to be more engaged with the sensory world and encoding the sensory world with sensitivity without so much reactivity related to that practicing of equanimity. And similarly, when using a similar kind of paradigm with standards and oddballs in the visual domain and assessing the impact of psilocybin on brain processing of these stimuli, so regular small circles with occasional even smaller circles and occasional black and white checkerboards that really engage this kind of conflict detection, a violation of the habituated expectation. You see a similar overall pattern with in the top row placebo, middle row low dose, and lower row high dose. This early sensory encoding activity, referred to as a P100 response, is enhanced in the psilocybin conditions, but the later frontal reactivity to the stimuli is decreased, comparing the darker red, placebo responding to the low dose and high dose, where the amplitude of that responding goes down. So I'm going to try to keep my my commentary short on this, as I mentioned, just skipping those couple of slides, and just want to leave with this kind of summary slide showing that on one level there's a similarity, and I'm going to point out both a similarity and a difference here. So you can see the on the left, the auditory oddball and auditory distractor responding in the so-called auditory P300 or oddball paradigm in long-term meditators, that there's evidence in meditation of an enhanced early sensory representation concurrently with a decreased later frontal reactivity. And similarly, comparing the effect of psilocybin to a placebo-containing pill, an enhancement on the right side there of the visual oddball and visual distractor, the amplitude of the sensory encoding, or the more bottom-up aspect of processing, is enhanced, and the amplitude of the later cognitive evaluation and attentional engagement is reduced by psilocybin. Now, the important thing to mention here is that these effects are quite reversible in the meditator's brain. In other words, when you ask the meditator to attend purposefully to the stimuli, instead of seeing this reduction of the later cognitive engagement that happens while they are meditating and ignoring the stimuli, you see that in general, the brain resources are even more available to engage with the sensory world than in the non-meditator. There's a whole line of evidence, some of which I've done and much of which others have done, showing that this essentially one aspect of engaging in meditation longitudinally over time is an enhancement of the brain's attentional resources. So this reduction of later cognitive attentional engagement is not an obligatory aspect of meditation, but more a state effect. When meditating and attempting to tune the external world out, then you successfully are able to do that. When attending with as much attention as possible to the external world, then you see an actual increase in the brain's attentional engagement. In contrast, the effect with psilocybin demonstrated here is an involuntary effect. The participants were doing their best to engage with the stimuli, and the brain just wouldn't let them fully engage in the attentional way, with this kind of frontal attentional engagement, a marker of the degree to which incoming stimuli are being fully incorporated in working memory and expectation of what's coming next moment to moment. So this state that psilocybin is putting people in at a brain physiology level is kind of like an involuntarily meditating state, as opposed to an increase in attentional flexibility that you see in long-term meditators. And I think this may also relate to why, in some cases, these kinds of substances can be harmful to one's experience. So one really does have to be careful about how one uses these substances, as you go into this bottom-up processing state with less capacity to make expected meanings out of the sensory world. You become a little more vulnerable to the conditions and intentions of the world around you. So it's just especially important to use these in therapeutic ways. So I'm going to leave it at that and pass along the baton to Dr. Grove.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Khan. That was a wonderful background on some of the psychophysiology and brain studies in this area. So we appreciate that. It's giving people, again, context to better understand the effects and usages of psilocybin. So we will move on now into our third and final presenter before we then move into our Q&A. So feel free, again, listening members of our community, to populate any questions you have into our Q&A section, and then we will tackle those at the completion of Dr. Grobe's presentation. So it's my honor to introduce the third and final presenter, Dr. Charles Grobe, a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the UCLA School of Medicine and the director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Harbor UCLA Medical Center. He has conducted clinical research with psychedelics since the early 1900s. From 2004 to 2008, he was the PI, or principal investigator, for the first study in several decades to examine the use of psilocybin treatment model for patients with advanced cancer anxiety. He has also conducted research into a range of effects of MDMA in both normal volunteers and in the selected subject population of adults with autism and with severe social anxiety. He has also conducted a series of, I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, ayahuasca research studies in Brazil. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Grobe has published numerous articles and chapters on the psychedelics in the medical and the psychiatric literatures, and he is founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute.
Great.
So my pleasure. I'm going to dip out, and then you can also post up your slides.
Great. Thank you. Let
Thank you.
me share the screen. Okay, great.
Perfect.
So, so thank you for inviting me to speak on this, I think, fascinating topic, which I've been really involved with on a number of levels for several decades. I will, in the interest of time, I'll try to be succinct. I may skip over some slides if they appear redundant from the other talks, but let's get on with this. So psychedelics for human suffering, kind of generalized. Do we have a new paradigm, particularly vis-a-vis psychiatry, for the new century? And that's really the question at hand. The obligatory financial disclosures, these have supported research. And so we know that in our country, we have increasing degrees of mental health disturbance, of suicide, growing rates of suicide, major depression, treatment-resistant depression, and we have an escalating I can see my slide. Escalating expenditures to try to contain the surging rates of mental disturbance. So And we've kind of gotten to the point where, in spite of escalating outlay of expenditure and services, we seem to be falling behind and have great difficulty staying abreast of the rising tide of mental disturbance. So are we at that point where we might consider that we are in need of a paradigm shift? The concept of a paradigm shift was first explicated by the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn in the early 1970s. A paradigm shift is defined as a radical change in underlying beliefs or theories, and generally an important change that happens. It occurs when the usual way of thinking about something or doing something is replaced by an entirely new and different way. So when it comes to conceptualizing various psychiatric disturbance and intervening, are we ready to really consider a full-on paradigm shift? And I will get back to kind of more detail later in the talk what that might mean. So I always find the nomenclature of these compounds of great interest. Psychedelic, the popular term in the culture coming from the 60s, it really arose out of a dialogue between Aldous Huxley, the great British literary figure, and Humphrey Osmond, a very prominent British-Canadian psychiatrist specialized in the treatment of alcohol use disorder. They had a correspondence going and were trying to come up with the ideal term for these unusual compounds. And Huxley suggested in verse I'm having a block here. To make this trivial world sublime, take 1/2 gram of phanerothine, one of the old suggested terms. And Osmond responded, yet to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. And so the term psychedelic was born. But one concern about psychedelic is that it's to too great a degree associated with the cultural phenomena of the 60s and early 70s. Entheogens, suggested by Houston Smith, generally referring to plant compounds that contain these unusual alkaloids, and they achieve a kind of can facilitate a psychospiritual epiphany, but not all psychedelics do this, and it's not a reliable feature. So then the more traditional term was hallucinogen, which often gets criticized because it's perceived as pathologizing these compounds. But if, as my old friend Ralph Metzner kind of shared with me, if you look at the Latin root of the term hallucinogen, you see it comes from the Latin hallucinare, which means mind wandering, mind journeying, mind traveling, or tripping, as you were. And I've also felt in the medical context, hallucinogen is the proper term, but there's a host of alternative terms, deliriants, mysticomimetics, fantasticants, a term of Louis Lewins, the famous German psychopharmacologist from early in the last century, psychotomimetics, because of its the early belief that these compounds might replicate psychotic experience, later debunked to some degree. So these are generally the options one has. And in a book I recently published, which I believe is the first formal textbook of these compounds, which I co-edited with Jim Grigsby at the University of Colorado, we settled on the term hallucinogen as being more appropriate in a professional, particularly a medical professional context. This is published by Guilford Press, by the way. So I think I probably, well, David had already described how the 5-HT2A receptor is the primary point of agonism with the classical psychedelics, and you can see that their chemical structure is very, very close to the the endogenous neurotransmitter serotonin. So it's very peculiar that these same compounds that grow from the earth, and which are psychedelic alkaloids in them, are very, very close to serotonin. Serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine, psilocybin is 4-phosphoroxy, and then dimethyltryptamine. They all have this 6-sided benzene ring and a 5-sided pyrrole ring with a nitrogen in it, which are generally commonplace with the classical hallucinogens. Some non-classic hallucinogens, N-bomb, active on a microgram level. It's a 5-HT2A and 2C agonist, but it has been substituted for LSD and bladder. And when we talk with our patients, particularly our younger patients who may be interested in experimenting with LSD, we have to caution them that not all bladder that is sold as LSD is LSD. N-bomb has been a substitute and has been held responsible for a number of fatalities, which were presumed to be caused by LSD, but it was not LSD, it was N-bomb. And Dave Nichols, a very prominent medicinal chemist, first at Purdue and now at the University of North Carolina, we wrote an article in the forensics literature a few years ago, kind of clarifying this issue. Salvinorm A is the isolated diterpene from the plant Sylvia divinorum, which is used for medicinal and spiritual purposes and amongst various indigenous groups and among the Mazatec Indians of Mexico. The active diterpene Salvinorm A can cause a very, very short acting, but very, very bizarre dissociative experience. And I have yet to interview anyone who has found this to be a drug of choice or has taken it more than once or twice. It could be a very disturbing experience. Ketamine we know a good deal about, as we do with MDMA. Both have been applied in clinical settings. And ibogaine also, the isolated alkaloid from the Iboga plant from West Africa, from Gabon, where it's used as a sacrament in syncretic religion. The ibogaine alkaloid has been used to treat addiction. It's considered to have some potential as an addiction interrupter. It also has some cardiotoxicity, so one needs to proceed with some caution. Many of the hallucinogens we're familiar with have their origins in plant form. David talked about psilocybin cubensis, which contains psilocybin and psilocin, and psilocybin is broken down to psilocin upon ingestion. Lophophora williamsi is peyote, and from which mescaline was first isolated and identified. And actually, the chemist, the investigator who first discovered mescaline from peyote was Arthur Hefter, after whom the Hefter Research Institute is named. Lewis Lewin had isolated a number of alkaloids from peyote, but in the animal experimentation could not determine which was the active, psychoactive alkaloid. And he left it up to his colleague Hefter, who decided to sequentially, methodically ingest himself each of the alkaloids on separate occasion, by which he in the late 1890s discovered mescaline. Claviceps purpura is an ergot fungus that grows on rye that is believed to be part of the beverage administered at the ancient Greek rites of Eleusis, the kikion, which contains lysergamides, not that dissimilar from lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD. Ayahuasca, I've spent an appreciable amount of time studying the range of effects of ayahuasca in Brazil. We did a number of field studies. Ayahuasca itself is a decoction of two plants, each of which, when ingested by them on their own, does nothing, because the active alkaloids are degraded by the monoamine oxidase enzyme system. But when brewed together, when in a rather complex multi-hour process, the bark of the Banisteriopsis vine and the leaf of Psychotria, the Psychotria contains a powerful hallucinogen DMT, inactive when taken by itself orally, but when taken with Banisteriopsis copy, which contains harmala alkaloids, harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine, which have monoamine oxidase inhibiting action. It shuts down the monoamine oxidase system and allows for absorption of the DMT and the Psychotria and subsequent central nervous system activation. This is a fascinating plant decoction, and I studied within the context of a syncretic church, which had permission from the government of Brazil to use it for religious purposes. And subsequently, there was a big federal case in the United States that I was involved with as an expert witness that actually was ruled favorably by a federal judge to protect freedom of religion rights of the UDV religion, which uses ayahuasca as a sacrament. And it was, DEA and Customs intervened with the function of the church, and the church sued for their freedom of religion rights. They won in federal court. It appealed to the Court of Appeals in Denver, won there as well, both panel and the full court. Then was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which announced its decision in 2006, essentially declaring that when taken within the context of religious practice, ayahuasca would be legally allowed. So this is an enormous precedent and quite a surprise to me. So here's the same kind of schematic drawing that David showed. This is actually from a drawing of the artist Kathleen Harrison, but you could see this mushroom shaman from rock painting or in caves from between 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. You can see the mushroom protuberances throughout the torso and the limbs, and the beehive mask that the presumed shaman is wearing. The significance of the beehive mask is that in the ancient world, there were great challenges in preserving foods and fungal material, but they found that honey was a good preservative. So that is believed to be the reason for the beehive mask. But these plants, these extraordinary plants, have been used for many millennia by indigenous peoples scattered about the world. There are well over 100 different species of plant hallucinogens have been identified. A wonderful book by Schultes and Albert Hoffman on plant hallucinogens really kind of provides tremendous detail. The book is called Plants of the Gods, and but we've learned through investigation that these plant compounds have been used for religious and medicinal purpose, also initiation rites, by diverse cultures around the world, and they've had a profound influence on the evolution of even modern civilization. The range of effects, we know that it impacts, perception, affect, cognition, a sustained alteration of consciousness, but for the most part, clear sensorium. It does not cause frank visual hallucinations. Rather, with eyes closed, it creates a visionary experience, often of thematic content, often as if it were a waking dream that tells a tale, that gives one a lesson, and often references back to what one's intention is to have this experience in the first place. When doing treatment with these compounds, I find it's very important to take some time going over with your patient, what is their intention for this experience? Is it to heal a condition? Is it to get insight? Is it to have some kind of spiritual epiphany? But get the patient to really articulate what their intention is. These compounds also cause synesthesia, a very unusual perceptual alteration of different perceptual modalities, picking up on different stimuli like hearing color or smelling sound, very unusual and distinct for a hallucinogen experience. And these compounds also induce a sense of union with others and with the natural world. I say during the time I spent in Brazil, particularly up in Manaus in the Amazon, I found that a great many of the people I got to know who were members of the UDV or the União Vegetal, the ayahuasca church, were also environmental activists, and some had taken that on as a career. They found their work with ayahuasca had really sensitized them not only to the beauties of nature, but to the impending catastrophes that await us unless we start to intervene and protect the natural world that's all around us. And these experience similar dreams, spontaneous epiphanies, and sometimes psychotic states, particularly in those individuals with underlying vulnerability, generally preservation of orientation, memory, and ego identity. And the significance of set and setting cannot be overestimated. Mental set is an individual. Who is that individual? What is his psychological makeup? What are his or her psychological vulnerabilities? What are their expectations? What are their intentions? The setting is where you're taking it, who you're taking it with, how protected is it, how safe is it, and how adept, how skilled are the facilitators. And I'm a big believer that these compounds are too unpredictable for most people to take on just on their own, that there should be someone providing some level of facilitation, someone who is not altered, who could address situations like someone is knocking at the door. How does one deal with that? So so set and setting, though, are critical predictors of outcome. Lester Grinspoon, a very well-known psychiatrist at Harvard for many years, published a very important book, came out in 1980, Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered. He reviewed the experience of the field until then. Keep in mind, hallucinogens came on the scene in the 50s, became all the rage in the 60s, both in psychiatry, thought to be the cutting edge, as well as the general culture, but studies were shut down in the early 70s. Grinspoon reviewed the 15 years of most active research and identified that upwards of 40,000 patients had been treated with hallucinogens in the 50s and 60s, and their experiences contributed to over 1,000 clinical papers. So looking at some of the treatment applications, one of the most impressive applications was the treatment of individuals with severe alcohol abuse disorder, one of the hardest conditions in medicine, psychiatry to treat. That was the case back in the 50s. That's the case even today. There's certainly a need for more effective treatments of alcoholics. And starting with Osmond in the late 50s, there was a strong indication of therapeutic efficacy, even with a one session treatment with a hallucinogen. Osmond also was the first to identify that individuals who during the course of what was often just a one session treatment, but who during the course of those many hours had a powerful mystical level experience or religious experience or a spiritual epiphany, that these were the individuals who were most likely to establish and maintain over the follow-up period sustained sobriety. So very, very important. And Stan Grof in the late 60s, early 70s corroborated that. Also other areas, chronic PTSD. We know with MDMA in the modern era, Michael Mithofer, working with the organization MAPS, has presented some very compelling data on the efficacy of MDMA in the treatment of chronic refractory PTSD. Obsessive compulsive disorder in the early 2000s, Francisco Moreno, a psychiatrist at University of Arizona, published a kind of a proof of concept study, finding that there was a signal for effective treatment of OCD. There were some studies back in the 60s, particularly in Denmark, that also observed positive outcomes with some severe incapacitated OCD patients. We also had antisocial behavior. There was the famous prison study of Leary and Ralph Metzner back in the early 60s, which had some methodological flaws, but also a more modern effort at University of Alabama, Peter Hendricks, looking at records of the prison population in Alabama and finding that those individuals who had a prior experience taking a psychedelic, even if only on one occasion prior to their being incarcerated, that they were far more likely not to relapse and go back to prison. So there was there's a distinct difference in recidivism rates that prior use of psychedelics appeared to contribute to improved behavior of individuals. Autism, there are a number of studies of subpar methodologies working with children to create some ethical issues. But that being said, we worked with MDMA treating a population of young adults with on the autism, high functioning on the autism spectrum with severe social anxiety. And we got a very strong signal of efficacy. And then finally, I'll spend a little more time on this area, the treatment of individuals approaching the end of life with advanced stage medical illness who are overwhelmed with existential angst, anxiety, demoralization. Some wonderful work was done demonstrating that a psychedelic treatment model may be a very effective treatment, starting with Eric Cass from the University of Chicago in the early 60s, extending to Gary Fisher and Sidney Cohen, both at UCLA, and then Walter Pankey, a psychiatrist at Harvard who had a doctorate in theology from the Harvard School of Divinity, did some groundbreaking work in this area and was followed up by his colleague at the University of Maryland, Stanislav Grof, who was a very, very accomplished and seasoned researcher in this area. But they published some very moving studies and books on the use of a psychedelic model for individuals approaching the end of life. I found very moving and really did a lot to inspire me to not only eventually study psychedelics, but go into psychiatry in the first place. So let's see. So looking at some other studies, phase 1 studies. So all research was shut down by the late 60s, early 70s. In the early 90s, our group at Harbor and a couple of other groups elsewhere got phase 1 research off the ground. Rick Strassman at New Mexico, looking at the range of effects of intravenous dimethyltryptamine. We had a kind of a dose finding study with MDMA at Harbor UCLA. Deborah Mash at University of Miami looked at the range of effects, physiological, psychological effects of ibogaine, and then we did our work down in Brazil, first in Manaus, looking at adult subjects, and collaborated here with Dennis McKenna and J.C. Calloway, and then several years later, in working in the southern urban cities of Brasilia, Campinas, Sao Paulo. My main collaborator there is Marlena Dobkin de Rios. We worked up adolescents who were from families that belonged to the UDV Syncretic Ayahuasca Church and who had permission from the government to participate in family ceremonies with parents and grandparents, where ayahuasca was utilized as a psychoactive sacrament. A very important paper and body of work coming out of Johns Hopkins, led by Roland Griffiths. Also in this work is Bill Richards, one of the maybe one of the most seasoned researchers in the field. Bill worked with Stan Grof starting in the mid-60s in Maryland and still working at Hopkins with Roland some over 50 years later. But Roland's very interested in the degree to which psychedelics can facilitate mystical level experiences, and he was able to successfully show that people could predictably encounter spiritual, psychospiritual epiphanies, which fit the criteria for mystical experience. And this is important to know that one can, and it was, if you look back at some of the early work of Groff and Osman, you see that having a mystical experience seemed to be predictive of a positive therapeutic outcome, even regardless of what the underlying condition was. So Roland Griffith's work demonstrating that you, under optimal conditions, you can reliably induce a powerful mystical level experience, which is predictive of a positive therapeutic outcome, I think is very important as this field moves forward. So a peak experience developed by Walt Pankey and Bill Richards is really a mystical experience, a sense of unity and oneness, transcendence, time and space, a very powerful positive mood, a sense of awe and reverence, powerful sense of meaning and insight one has, ineffability, very difficult to articulate, to put into words these experiences, paradoxicality, what you think your experience may not at all be what is really going on, and transiency. You know, while you're in the throes of the experience, it's as if it's an eternity. It's going on forever. But once it's over, there's this sense of it's gone in the flash of an eye. So these are some of the distinct experiences of psychedelics. Phase 2 studies. We did I'll talk a little bit about our data, a pilot study of treating individuals with advanced stage cancer-related anxiety with a moderate dose of psilocybin. The FDA kind of shot down our first submission when we were going for a high dose, basically saying, no one has looked at this compound in decades. Let's start off more cautiously. And I thought that was reasonable. We did a lot of back and forth. And 0.2 mg per kg body weight is a reasonable moderate level dose. And certainly, we had no safety issues, and that may have been one of the issues. We had a more moderate dose in a couple of the other groups. And after we published, Steve Ross at NYU kind of basically used our protocol, which we gave to him, and we both used niacin placebos. Roland Griffiths, who had his own kind of independent methodology and also permission to use a higher yet dose, used an extremely low dose psilocybin as the active placebo control. And this, niacin was problematic because of the notorious niacin reaction. And after watching a couple of those with my subjects, I vowed off of ever using niacin again. But the low dose psilocybin model is problematic as well, because if there's any merit to the microdose approach, then perhaps even dosages that are presumed to be sub-threshold could be doing something. So there is this ongoing search for the ideal active placebo, and I don't think we've found it just yet. Although I can share with you at the end of the talk what we've come up with for our new study. This is our treatment room. We started off with very drab, standard hospital room. We fixed it up really nicely, kind of cocooned the patient in there with, fabrics and wall hangings and flowers and all sorts of stuff. Subjects are provided with several preparatory psychotherapy sessions after being screened in. We utilize a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover methodology. Our active placebo was niacin. We worked in our GCRC setting, which unfortunately, it's an NIH funding process that is no longer available. And we had several follow-up, eval, and integrative sessions. We treated 12 subjects. 13 are listed here because number 8 a few days before her scheduled first session dropped out. So, but curiously, we had 11 female subjects, only 1 male. I'm not sure why that was the case. Ages range from mid-30s to late 50s. We had 4 people with metastatic breast cancer, 3 with colon and colorectal cancer, 2 with ovarian cancer, and 1 each with multiple myeloma, salivary gland cancer, and peritoneal cancer. You could see the various degrees that they had survived to date. All subjects passed within a couple of years of participation in the study. We published in the Archives of General Psychiatry in 2000. 2011, considered at that point the #1 impact journal in the field. So we felt this was a kind of a validation by the field that we were ready once again to take on what had been kind of taboo for many decades. You know, when I was in medical school and I brought up the topic of wouldn't it be interesting to go back and study hallucinogens, I found out very quickly that that was not an acceptable topic for within medicine. But by the 21st century, I think we are at that place where the field is opening up again, and this is maybe first manifested by being able to get published in a high-ranked journal, but also if you can see, identify the tremendous number of studies that are being conducted now. But back to our psilocybin study with individuals with advanced stage cancer, you can see physiologically very well tolerated, very minimal jump in heart rate, systolic blood pressure, no real significant differences after the drug is administered. Oh, wait, I want to see something. You see diastolic blood pressure. The diastolic only went up to the high 70s, and that's would not evoke any concern. Looking at depression ratings, the Beck scale, looking at a kind of a contrast between the two different groups. Everyone is blinded for 2 weeks after treatment. You see no differences. But if you look at when you cum all the findings, everyone acted as their own control. Should mention that. So you were randomized either into receiving psilocybin first or receiving a placebo first. Everyone is blinded. A month later, you come back for your second session, and whatever condition you did not get the first time, you get the second time, and only the research pharmacists kind of knew exactly what people were getting. But here you can see that a sustained improvement of mood that extended for the 6-month follow-up period. Looking at anxiety, looking at the state trait anxiety inventory, state anxiety, it's how anxious do you feel in the moment, no short or longer term differences. But if you look at trait anxiety, like how anxious would you assess you've been over the last couple of weeks, you see that whereas there's no difference between the two groups after the first couple of weeks, after everyone gets treated, again, a sustained drop in trait anxiety that even reached statistically significant proportions at a couple of points, which, given the modest N we had, was kind of surprising, but also gratifying to see it fit our hypothesis going in. Steve Ross and Tony Bassis at NYU did a very similar study published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. They had a higher dosage that they were allowed to use. They got even more impressive results. And Hopkins, a higher dosage yet. I think there were some increased safety issues, but they had greater efficacy. And I think the beauty of this treatment isn't that simply that someone feels good the day of treatment or the day after or the day after that, but that the improved mood and the amelioration of anxiety could sustain over many, many months. Here, 6-month follow-ups, still finding very, very positive reports. Other phase 2 studies at NYU and UNM, Michael Bogenschutz recently published on his treatment of alcohol abuse disorder, getting a good outcome in sync with Graf's early work and Osmond's early work back in the 60s and 50s. Peter Hendricks at Alabama has treated low SEC minority cocaine and crack addicts with good outcome. A very interesting study at Hopkins by Matt Johnson, an application I never thought of, but he came up with it, smoking cessation, finding very favorable results. And recently, NIDA has funded a extension of the smoking cessation study, and this is the first time NIDA has actually provide funding for a psychedelic treatment study. And there's been some examination of unipolar depression, starting off in England with the Imperial College London group.
Dr. Grove, I just want to give us some time for Q&A. So when you...
Yes, okay, I'll fly.
And I know you have to also bounce at 2.
I got another talk I got to give. So, big businesses getting involved. FDA is giving breakthrough therapy status for psilocybin and MDMA. Conventional paradigm, we give drugs daily for weeks, months, years to ameliorate or presume brain state. insight or attitude, not thought to be significant. But the psychedelic paradigm, this would represent a big paradigm shift, where a drug need be only administered once or on a handful of occasions, separated out in time, loosens defenses, facilitates insight. The mystical experience certainly may be a predictor of positive outcome, but you need very careful monitoring and supportive psychotherapy. This book just kind of really blew the lid off the culture, and I think great interest surged after its publication. Michael Pollan's book. You've even seen in the last few years initiatives in several states, Denver, Oakland, Santa Cruz, and a couple of cities and then states, Colorado and Oregon, have decriminalized, moving to legalization. And Oregon and Colorado are coming up with models for utilization of mushrooms in treatment. So decriminalize, now what? A lot of challenges await. And I think these groups that have pushed for decriminalization need to address public education to make sure individuals fully understood the safety parameters. This is just a poster from FDA. They've been very good about really getting on board, and they invited a bunch of us in the field to come to their headquarters in Silver Spring to talk about psychedelics and the research we've conducted, and they've taken this to heart, and they've been very, I think, all in all, they're careful, but they're also supportive, and they're allowing well thought out studies with good safety parameters to move forward. Also, philanthropic donations have been extraordinary. Hopkins got upwards of $20 million recently to start a psychedelic research center. Also, Mass General at UCLA and other UC schools are also starting to put together their own psychedelic research programs. Big business is also getting involved, and one needs to, I think, be very, very cautious about this. They are evaluated in the billions of dollars, some of these. And, my concern is that in order to maximize return on investment for their investors, they're going to have to cut costs. And my concern is it'll erode safety parameters. So, a little bit of my current study, the great existential dilemma. Antidepressants and conventional psychotherapy are of limited efficacy with individuals approaching the end of life. You can see here, these are the controlled studies that have explored using a psychedelic model. Our study, we call it a pragmatic trial of psilocybin treatment and palliative care. We're going to partner up with palliative practitioners. We utilize a manual-driven meaning and purpose therapy from a psychologist in Australia, David Kassane. So we're taking an existential psychotherapy approach. We're using a moderate to moderate high dose psilocybin, and we're primarily looking at demoralization. Secondary variables would be depression, anxiety, quality of life, spirituality, and pain. We're using a ketamine oral ingested active placebo. We feel it'll cause, and ketamine is already being used with these patients. And this is not a head-to-head trial. We're just trying to find an active placebo which would induce an altered state, which may not make it so easy for patients to discern what they're on. We start enrollment hopefully at the end of the summer, and hopefully within a couple of years we'll have our data and a manuscript ready for submission. Final slide. These little guys are mushroom stones from 1,000 years ago in Central America, and I like to think they're looking out on us, the modern inheritors of their sacred plants, and their message is use these plants with great respect, because they have sacred qualities and they can have wondrous healing effects, but only if one optimizes the conditions and the intentions under which they're taken. So finally, we need to learn from the lessons of the past, both the preceding generation of researchers in the 50s and 60s, but also the indigenous people who were the true experts in this area. And maybe the important thing is that in order for this field to maintain and to move forward in in a healthy way. We need to optimize safety and ethical standards. There have been problems in both these regards in the past, so we really need to focus in and not give it short shrift. We need to examine public health implications, make sure that what happened in the 60s, which was that the drugs spilled out of the research labs into the general population, particularly among kids, and became, to some degree with some vulnerable individuals, highly problematic. There's the issue of microdosing. Is it really efficacious or not? It was very exciting to read anecdotal cases, but some hard, quantitative data that's coming out now in the microdose model is a little more hesitant to endorse its efficacy. We need greater diversity in the field, both patients. We need more socioeconomic diversity, more racial diversity. We need this in the amongst the research groups as well. We need to have more women need to be in positions of authority, and we need more people of color also, collaborating and taking lead roles. The regulatory obstacles, honestly, I've done this research now for 30 years. It's manageable as long as you're willing to to engage in dialogue. I find the regulatory agencies very collegial, and sometimes they give us very good advice, which improves the quality of our protocols. Funding options, one really needs to look at this very seriously. Ideally, the government would fund these studies, but those are few and far between. Philanthropy would be next of import, but you can't always count on philanthropy. It really depends on the state of the economy. And the for-profit businesses jumping into this field concerns me, concerns others. There's been some controversy over patents that have been submitted that seems somewhat specious. So and then the expanded access issue. So that's it for my talk with a little time left.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay. If
I'll
everybody
stop
can
the
turn,
share.
yeah, and if everybody can turn on their camera, that'd be terrific. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciated the evidence and some of the trial design methods, rigor, and considerations. It's really important for our audience, our communities to be thinking about that, as well as some of the history like we talked about before. We have 3 questions. Let me get to them in the Q&A. So Sarah Gorbin asks for Dr. Connor, are you familiar with a form of meditation, for example, let's see, Vipassana compared to the transcendental, compared to the mindfulness, influences the comparative effects with psilocybin or other psychedelics, such as different neuroimaging results? It's kind of a big question. We only have 9 minutes before we.
Yeah, I'll give just a brief answer to that. And there's also this second question she put in there about neuroimaging and whether brain activation findings tend to be symmetrical or asymmetrical. The main thing is there's really only a handful of studies that have directly contrasted in, the same population, the effects of meditation and psychedelics. And 2 of the larger have been run by Roland Griffiths and his group at Johns Hopkins. One was just, comparing a series of psychedelic therapy sessions over time with their kind of normal treatment as usual kind of supportive care versus an enhanced kind of spiritual practice group that included some meditation instruction of a kind of mantra-based practice, so-called passage meditation by Eknath Easwaran. And that showed the expected, hypothesized effect that some of the benefits, subjective benefits and even benefits as rated by significant others in people's lives in the group that went through the kind of spiritual support intervention instead of just the psychedelic assisted therapy treatment as usual in their protocol intervention. There were greater benefits, and those benefits seem to accrue with time. After 6 months after the last session, those benefits were even greater comparing the 2 different groups. no radically different changes, but that doesn't say much about the specifics of which practice might be, most beneficial, and if it's even similar from one person to another. In general, people tend to gravitate towards different practices because it feels good for them, and or just some kind of luck of the draw. The one kind of piece of harder evidence that they haven't published yet, but I've seen the data, is related to, I think, an important distinction that in general, the more open awareness forms of meditative practice, Vipassana or non-dual type practices, are more easily kind of consonant with the acute effects of psychedelics. People will rate that their experience with those practices is both easier and a little bit more powerful in terms of the internal state of really being in a deep meditative state. Whereas the more focused types of practices that involve mantra or focusing just on the breath, there's a tendency for the effect of psilocybin to be such that you're not able to channelize the attention quite as effectively. So while the effect may still have some positive experience to it, it also feels a little like you're kind of pushing against the limitations of the attentional expansion that the psychedelic is encouraging versus this kind of channelizing of attention that the practice is focused on. So that's the main kind of hard evidence looking at the impact of two different practices that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Good question. There's so many great questions that we have limited time. So I kind of want to ask something generically so that people can all three of you can chime in a little bit before we run out. And so there are questions about, big industry involvement and how do we take these types of disruptive ideas and tools and put them into play in the medical healthcare system? How do we move these ideas where we feel there's been traditions and decades of research that support them and more rigorous trials coming out? What's the place on the treatment shelf, and how do we impact the environments in which we work to actually move these more disruptive interventions forward? Or I might like to say more innovative, right, interventions forward with our patients. And we can kind of go around giving everybody just a couple of minutes before we have to wrap up to address that. You want to go first, Dr. Grove? I see you positioning.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a great, that's really the question right now. We're starting to get a sense that these drugs in optimal circumstances can be of enormous help. We also know that some people have gone off the rails and have sustained damage. So I think we do need to kind of focus in hard on safety parameters. For instance, I thought you were going to ask a question about microdosing. What I was going to say there is, so far the evidence is limited for efficacy, but there's also a concern that there are the hallucinogens are active not just at 5-HT2A receptors, but also 5-HT2B as well as others. The 5-HT2B receptors have a role in maintaining functional integrity of cardiac valves. So there's a concern of frequent pulsing with the microdose model. Could we be creating cardiac issues? Are we particularly individuals who are already predisposed to serious arrhythmias? So I say moving forward, we need to really establish a very, very strong foundation where we have a good grasp on safety parameters, know how to properly screen, know how to properly protect people. There's also the issue of ethics, that individuals need to abide by a strong, facilitators need to abide by a strong code of ethics. And there have been some concerns in this realm as well. So I think this is where the focus needs to be. You also raise, I think, an important issue that often gets overlooked, which is, we may have isolated alkaloids in the lab, but we're not the first to understand these compounds and to utilize them for salutary purpose. These were the ancient peoples, the indigenous peoples, some of the most marginalized people in the modern world. And we have sacred knowledge that they at great risk to in the past to the lives of and existence of communities, the lives of the people, because they were brutally persecuted when using these plants. They held these secrets really for us to take. Are we going to appropriate them and just profit off them, as is the tendency in our modern world, or do we understand there's a need to bring in marginalized peoples, particularly people from indigenous communities where there's a tradition, and create some kind of process whereby they get to partake of some of the positive gain, whether it's participating in a therapeutic context or receiving some kind of payment or land grants or whatever. We can't forget about the indigenous people, as is too often the case.
I appreciate that. It's a very valuable point, and creating access and inclusion, right, is what you're talking about, so that it circles back to tradition and the ancestries and where it rightfully sat to begin with. And that, we're a tool in some sense to kind of try to advance the science and the application, and to work collaboratively to bring this to our communities for health, right? For health and spirit. And I think that's the driving force. So I'd like to hear it from Dr. Presti. Is there something you'd like to add or comment on?
Thank you. Yeah, I very much agree with what Charlie Grove just said, and believe that, we have this tendency in our model of reality that if we understand something scientifically, that we have some degree of control over that. And I believe actually that the psychedelics are going to shake us up a little bit around that, and they will force us to honor a larger perspective on reality. And I think the larger perspective on reality, it not only honors the indigenous origins of many of these materials, because that tends to be somewhat descriptive of the worldview that many cultures hold, about some kind of deeply interconnective relationship between who we are as conscious living beings and the rest of the biosphere. And so I think we're going to be pushed in that direction, which I believe will be a good thing for us. And that I see this as a real opportunity. And of course, the devil is in the details around how slowly or quickly you might be able to move kind of the medical paradigm, but that this will force us to expand our medical paradigm around mental health. And this is really an old conversation. This is not dissimilar to a conversations that Thomas Sez and Artie Lang had in psychiatry, 60 years ago.
Yes.
But psychedelics take that conversation to another level. And I think we're only at the beginning of that right now. And one more thing I'd like to stress the importance of, given that Rael Khan's presence here, is that the interaction of the use of these powerful medicines with contemplative practice and with contemplative community in a way to really maintain whatever gains one may have had during that experience, I believe, is key to really making them as valuable as they potentially can be.
That's a wonderful point. And Dr. Khan, would you like to add to that before we wrap up?
I think that pointing that direction, is really it's really all that needs to be done at this point. I know that there are those, including myself, in the field who are trying to systematically start exploring that, and I really do feel it will be helpful in terms of its kind of integrated impact in people's lives as well as community building.
Right. I love the emphasis on the integrative aspects of the complementary nature of psilocybin in this case, or psychedelics, where we're talking about it's not the panacea, but it's something that can complement or work alongside with contemplative practices or other types of therapies for the health and the wellness of our patients, the families, our communities, ourselves, right? I think that's a really big emphasis and very important sort of underscore. And I think we can land on that. You are all pioneers of ancestral work, right? I mean, in the sense that it's sort of a paradox to say that, but it's true that you're continuing on in an area that has been around for a very long time and trying to make it relevant to our current society in, again, the 21st century. So reinvigorating, performing some CPR on practices that happened in the 60s and the 50s. And I take my hat off to all of you as pioneers in this space. And we're so happy with Dr. Khan and myself to collaborate between the Center of Bioinformatics Science as well as the Institute for Integrative Health and Wellness to bring you here and to have this wonderful presentation. So thank you all very much today. And for our audience and our community who hung in there for 2 hours, appreciate that. And thank you for your time. And you can contact us if you have questions. And the recording of this will be on both the CMS and the IIHW websites for you to access if you want to look at it or send it off to your colleagues and friends. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thank you so much for tuning in and for your illuminating discussions today.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.